Elena Ruiz never imagined that coming home would feel like stepping into a storm. For 6 years, she had been living far from her family, working as a nurse in another city. She had left home with small dreams, a quiet life, enough money to pay her student loans and freedom from the endless arguments that filled her parents' house. But that freedom was short-lived. One phone call changed everything. It came one rainy afternoon while she was finishing her shift at the hospital. Her mother's voice trembled through the line. "Elena, come home. It's your sister. There's been an accident." Those words pulled the ground out from under her. Vivian, her beautiful, perfect older sister, was the one everyone looked up to. She was supposed to get married in a few weeks to Alexander Grant, a wealthy businessman from a family known all over the city. Their wedding had been in every magazine. Their love story, or what people believed to be love, was something her parents never stopped talking about. Elena didn't ask for details. She simply packed her bag, requested emergency leave, and took the next bus home. The long ride felt endless, each minute filled with fear and confusion. She watched the rain slide down the window, wondering what kind of accident could bring her proud, strong sister to the edge of life. When she reached her family home, the lights were still on despite it being late. Her mother rushed to open the door, her face pale and swollen from crying. Her father stood behind her, silent, his usual stern expression cracked with exhaustion. Elena barely had time to put down her bag before her mother broke into sobs. "She's in a coma, Elena," the doctor said. "They don't know when she'll wake up." Elena froze. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. The next morning, she went to the hospital to see Vivian. The room was cold, the air filled with the quiet rhythm of machines. Vivian lay there, pale and still, tubes running from her arms. Elena sat beside her, holding her sister's hand, whispering her name again and again. But there was no answer, only the steady mechanical sound of breathing that wasn't quite her own. Days turned into a week. The family took turns sitting by Vivian's side, praying for a miracle. But with every passing day, the doctor's words became less hopeful. "Her condition is stable," they said, "but she may not wake up for months, maybe longer." It was during one of those nights when the house was quiet and the rain was falling again that Elena overheard her parents arguing in the living room. She had just come downstairs for water when she heard her father's low voice filled with worry. "We can't let this ruin us," he said. "The Grants have already spent a fortune on this wedding. The press, the business partners, the invitations. If this falls apart, we'll lose everything." Her mother's voice broke through. "How can you talk about business when our daughter is lying in a hospital bed? You think they'll still help us after this?" He snapped. "The deal was tied to that marriage. Alexander's company was supposed to invest in our firm after the wedding. Now everything is falling apart. We have debts piling up. The bank is calling every week. If the Grants pull out, we're finished." Elena stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move. She had known her father was struggling financially, but she hadn't realized it was this bad. Her mother said softly, "But she's in no condition to marry. How could we even—" "Then someone has to," her father interrupted. "Do you understand what's at stake? Our name, our business, our home. Everything depends on this connection." There was silence for a long time. Then her mother whispered something that made Elena's heart drop. "You can't be thinking what I think you are." Her father's reply came slowly, with the weight of something he had already decided. "Elena looks like her. Same height, same hair. If she wears the veil, no one outside the families will know. The legal papers can be arranged quietly. It's just a formality until Vivian recovers." The glass in Elena's hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Both her parents turned, startled, as she stepped into the room, her face pale with disbelief. "You want me to marry her fiancé?" she said, her voice trembling. "Are you both out of your minds?" Her father sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand, Elena. It's the only way to protect the family." "Protect the family?" she repeated. "By lying to everyone? By turning me into someone I'm not?" Her mother started crying again. "Please don't raise your voice. You know your father has been under so much pressure." "He's not thinking clearly." But her father wasn't backing down. He looked at Elena with tired, desperate eyes. "We're already drowning. The contracts are tied to the wedding date. If it doesn't happen, we lose the partnership, the clients, the house. Everything your sister worked for, everything we built." Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're talking about business while she's fighting for her life. She's your daughter. She's also the reason we have a chance to survive, he said quietly. And right now, you're the only one who can save us. The argument went on for hours. Elena said no again and again, but her parents kept pleading. Her father talked about duty. Her mother talked about family honor. By morning, she felt too drained to fight anymore. She went upstairs, locked herself in her room, and cried until her voice was gone. That night, she went to the hospital again, unable to sleep. She sat by Vivian's bed, looking at her peaceful face. They had never been close growing up. Vivian was the golden child, confident, beautiful, loved by everyone. Elena had always been the quiet one, the one people forgot at family parties. Still, seeing her sister lying there so helpless broke something inside her. She spoke softly, even though she knew Vivian couldn't hear her. I don't know what to do. They want me to take your place. I can't, Viv. It's your life, not mine. The only answer was the soft beeping of the monitor. A week later, the pressure became unbearable. The Grant's lawyer came to visit. He spoke politely, but his tone carried a warning. The media was starting to ask questions. The wedding invitations had already gone out, and canceling now would cause a scandal. Alexander Grant himself was still unconscious, lying in a private hospital wing under strict supervision. He had been in the same car as Vivian when the accident happened. His injuries were worse, but he was alive, though barely. The lawyer explained that the marriage could still go through legally, even if Alexander was not awake. The families had already signed agreements, and it would protect both parties from lawsuits and financial loss. It's what Mr. Grant's parents prefer, he said calmly. The arrangements can be kept private until both are recovered. Elena listened in disbelief. It felt like she was in someone else's story, a story where logic didn't exist. But when her father looked at her that night, his eyes red and tired, she knew he was begging more than commanding. If you do this, he said softly, you'll be saving all of us. I know it's unfair, but sometimes life demands things we don't choose. Elena didn't answer. She just nodded weakly, though her chest felt heavy with something close to grief. The next few days passed in a blur. Her parents took care of the paperwork quietly. The ceremony was planned in the hospital chapel. Simple, discreet, attended only by both families and a lawyer. Elena didn't even have time to think about what she was agreeing to. She just went through the motions, numb and silent. The morning of the wedding felt unreal. She stood in front of the mirror wearing a simple white dress, not Vivian's but one quickly bought to fit her size. The veil covered most of her face. Her mother helped her fasten it, whispering, "Thank you, my child." Though her hands were shaking, Elena's reflection didn't look like her. She looked like a shadow of her sister, a quiet imitation of someone who once filled every room with laughter. The chapel smelled faintly of flowers and disinfectant. The priest spoke softly, reading from the script. Alexander's parents stood beside his wheelchair, his body still weak, his eyes closed, breathing shallowly. He didn't hear the vows, didn't move when the ring was slipped on his finger. Elena's hands trembled as she repeated the words she barely understood. Her voice caught when she said, "I do." When it was over, she didn't feel married. She felt hollow. Everyone congratulated her in low voices, calling it an act of faith, of family unity. But she could barely meet anyone's eyes. That evening, when she returned home, she locked herself in her room and sat on the floor, still wearing the dress. The house was quiet again. Her mother knocked softly, asking if she was all right, but Elena couldn't answer. She stared at her hands, the ring glinting faintly under the light, and felt like she had been erased. In the following days, the world moved on as if nothing strange had happened. The papers were signed, the partnership saved, the family's reputations protected. Her father smiled again for the first time in months, telling her that things would get better now. But Elena couldn't share his relief. She went to the hospital every day, not because she was told to, but because she couldn't stay away. She sat by Alexander's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering what he would say if he ever woke up and learned the truth. Would he hate her? Would he even believe it? The nurses began to know her by name. Some whispered behind her back, unsure of what to make of the situation. Others treated her kindly, thinking she was a devoted wife caring for her injured husband. No one knew that she had never even spoken to the man she was married to. At night, she would go home and stand by Vivian's door, afraid to go inside. Her mother spent every evening praying beside her sister's bed, whispering that everything was going to be okay. But Elena couldn't believe that anymore. One evening, while she sat beside Alexander's bed, she spoke to him softly, the way she used to talk to patients who couldn't respond. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, "but I hope you wake up soon. Because none of this makes sense without you." The air was quiet. The machines beeped steadily. Then for a moment she thought she saw his fingers twitch. She leaned forward, heart pounding, but it didn't happen again. Maybe she had imagined it. Still, that tiny movement gave her a spark of hope. Hope that maybe one day the truth would come out and she wouldn't have to live this lie anymore. Days turned into weeks. The doctors said Alexander's condition was improving slowly. Elena continued visiting him, speaking softly, reading aloud from newspapers, even telling him about her day. It felt strange, but it also made her feel less alone. One afternoon, as she was adjusting his blanket, she noticed something that made her freeze. There was a faint smile on his lips, barely visible but real. She sat down quickly, unsure if it was another illusion, but the sight made her eyes fill with tears. For the first time since the accident, she whispered, "Maybe you can hear me after all." That night, when she returned home, her father was talking on the phone in the living room. His voice was calm, confident again, the voice of a man who believed everything was back under control. But when he saw Elena, he said something that chilled her. "The investors are happy. Now all we need is for him to wake up and everything will be perfect." Elena forced a smile and went upstairs. But deep inside she knew nothing about this was perfect. It was a lie built on desperation and she was trapped in it, a silent bride to a man who didn't even know her name. Still, each morning she returned to the hospital, carrying fresh flowers, sitting beside Alexander, waiting for something and anything to change. She didn't know what she was hoping for anymore. Forgiveness, maybe, or a second chance to live a life that was truly hers. But as she watched him lying there, peaceful and still, she realized one thing. Fate had already chosen a path for her, and there was no going back. The days after the quiet wedding passed like a blur for Elena. Everyone around her seemed to act as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside she felt trapped between two lives, one that wasn't really hers, and one that no longer existed. The papers had been signed. She was now, on paper, the wife of a man she had never spoken to, never shared a single memory with. The thought made her chest ache every time she saw his name written beside hers. Her parents moved through the house with relief, as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted off their shoulders. Her father smiled again, talking on the phone for long hours, discussing contracts and business deals. Her mother kept busy with the hospital visits, taking food for the nurses and flowers for Vivian's room. No one talked about what had really happened. It was as if silence could erase the truth. Elena tried to return to her normal habits. She cooked, cleaned, and helped her mother. But the house no longer felt like home. Every corner reminded her of the lie she was living. Even when she slept, she dreamed of Vivian waking up, asking what had happened and looking at her with betrayal in her eyes. One morning, the Grant family's driver arrived at the door with a message. Mrs. Grant wanted to see her. Elena's heart tightened. She hadn't spoken to Alexander's mother since the ceremony. When she arrived at the Grant mansion, she felt out of place immediately. The grand white house stood on a hill surrounded by trees, its tall glass windows shining in the sun. Inside, everything smelled of polished wood and roses. The walls were lined with photographs of Alexander and his parents, smiling at events, standing beside famous people, posing with confidence. Mrs. Grant was waiting for her in the drawing room. She was elegant, graceful, and carried herself like someone used to being in control. She gestured for Elena to sit. "I wanted to thank you for your understanding," she said politely. "This situation has been difficult for both families." Elena nodded silently. She didn't know what to say. Mrs. Grant continued, her voice calm but firm. "As you know, Alexander is still under care at our private medical wing. His condition is improving, though slowly. The doctors have recommended keeping his surroundings familiar. That's why we believe it's best if you move into the mansion." Elena blinked. "You mean, live here?" Mrs. Grant gave a small, controlled smile. "Yes, you are his wife now. It will look proper to the world. And perhaps your presence will help his recovery." The words sank in slowly. Elena wanted to say no, She wanted to say she couldn't, that it didn't feel right. But before she could speak, Mrs. Grant added, "We'll make all arrangements for your comfort. You will have your own space, and of course you'll have access to see Alexander whenever you wish." It was clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was an order wrapped in politeness. That evening, Elena packed her things in silence. Her mother cried softly as she folded her clothes. "You'll be fine, my dear," she said. "Just remember, everything you're doing is for the family." Her father hugged her briefly, his eyes full of something like guilt, though he didn't say a word. The next morning, the driver came to take her to the mansion. She looked back once at her old home before the car pulled away, realizing she didn't know when, or if, she would come back. The Grant mansion was beautiful, but it felt cold. The kind of beauty that didn't make you feel warm. It only reminded you that you didn't belong. A housekeeper named Maria showed her to a room on the second floor. It was large and bright, but too neat, too quiet. The windows overlooked a garden filled with white lilies. "This was arranged for you, ma'am," Maria said politely. Elena winced slightly at the word ma'am. It didn't feel right. She thanked her softly, then sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the unfamiliar room. She felt like a visitor in someone else's life. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Grant came to see her again and led her to the medical wing where Alexander was being treated. The hallway was silent except for the soft hum of machines. When they entered his room, Elena's breath caught in her throat. He looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. His dark hair was neatly brushed, his skin pale against the white sheets. There were small scars on his forehead from the accident. His hands rested on the blanket, motionless. Elena felt an ache she couldn't explain. She walked slowly to his bedside and looked at him for a long time. "He's just sleeping," she whispered, almost to herself. Mrs. Grant nodded. "He has good days and bad ones. The doctors are hopeful. You can sit with him whenever you like." Sometimes familiar voices can help the healing process. When Mrs. Grant left the room, Elena stayed. She sat in the chair beside the bed, unsure of what to do. After a long silence, she began to talk softly, like she used to with her patients. She told him about the weather, about how quiet the house was, about the lilies in the garden. She didn't know if he could hear her, but it made her feel less lonely. The nurses came and went quietly, checking on him, adjusting machines. They greeted her politely, calling her Mrs. Grant. Every time she heard the name, it made her heart twist a little. Days turned into weeks. Elena's new life settled into a strange routine. Each morning she would visit Alexander's room, bring flowers, and talk to him for a while. In the afternoon, she would help around the house, read in the library, or walk in the garden. The staff remained respectful but distant. Some looked at her with quiet sympathy, others with suspicion. She could feel their eyes following her, whispering when she passed. She didn't blame them. She was a mystery in this house. A woman who had married a man who couldn't speak. A bride without a wedding, a wife without a husband. Sometimes, she sat in the living room and listened to the ticking clock, wondering what Vivian would think if she could see her now. Would she hate her for taking her place, or would she understand? One evening, as she was sitting beside Alexander, reading softly from a book, she thought she saw his fingers twitch. Her heart jumped. She leaned closer, whispering, "Alexander, can you hear me?" But there was no response. His hand lay still again. She sighed and set the book down, feeling foolish for getting her hopes up. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep inside he was trying to reach out. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She walked through the halls of the mansion, the marble floors cold under her bare feet. She stopped by the window and looked out at the dark garden. The moonlight fell softly on the lilies, and for the first time she felt truly alone. The next morning she was sitting at breakfast when Mrs. Grant joined her. She was reading a newspaper and didn't look up as she spoke. "We'll be having some guests next week. Friends of the family. I expect you to be present." Elena hesitated. "Of course." "They know nothing about the accident details," Mrs. Grant continued. "They believe the wedding took place before it happened. So please keep your answers simple if anyone asks." Elena nodded again. Her stomach tightened at the thought of pretending in front of strangers. But she had no choice. The guests arrived on a bright afternoon. Wealthy friends, business partners, and distant relatives filled the house with polite laughter and chatter. Elena smiled when needed, answered questions carefully, and stayed close to Mrs. Grant. Most people complimented her politely, saying how graceful she looked. No one suspected a thing. But one man, a business associate named Harold, seemed to study her with curious eyes. "You seem different," he said during dinner. "I remember Alexander mentioning his fiancée once. You look like her, but quieter somehow." Elena's throat tightened. She forced a small smile. "Maybe I've just had a lot on my mind lately." He nodded slowly, but she could tell he didn't believe her completely. After that night, she avoided him. Later, when the guests had gone, Mrs. Grant came to her room. "You handled yourself well," she said. "You're learning quickly." Elena only smiled weakly. She didn't feel proud of herself. Every kind word felt like a lie she didn't deserve. The following weeks were quieter. Alexander's condition remained stable, and the doctors said there were small signs of improvement. Elena continued her routine, reading to him, talking softly, waiting. One afternoon, while adjusting his blanket, she noticed a small photo frame on the bedside table. It was of Alexander and Vivian, taken before the accident. They looked happy, or at least like two people who knew how to look happy for the camera. Elena stared at the photo for a long time. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of person Alexander really was. Was he kind, proud? Would he have loved Vivian if the accident hadn't happened? Would he have ever even noticed her? The quiet sister in the background? As the weeks turned into months, something changed inside her. She still felt trapped, but the walls didn't feel quite as cold. She began to notice small things. The sound of the rain on the windows. The smell of roses that filled the hallways. The way the morning light fell across Alexander's face. She found herself talking to him more often, telling him about her day, her memories, even her fears. It was strange, but she began to feel a connection, one that made no sense. One evening, as she sat by his bed, she said softly, "You don't know me, but somehow I feel like I know you now. I see you every day. I talk to you more than I talk to anyone else. Maybe one day when you wake up, we can really meet for the first time." Her voice broke slightly at the last words. She brushed a tear from her cheek, embarrassed by her own emotions. She stood to leave, but then something made her freeze. A faint sound. A whisper, almost too soft to hear. It came from the bed. She turned quickly, heart racing. "Alexander?" His lips moved slightly, but no words came. Then she heard it again, clearer this time. A breath followed by a single word that sent chills through her body. "Elena." Her heart stopped. She stood frozen for several seconds, unable to move. Had she imagined it? She stepped closer. "Alexander, can you hear me?" But his face was still again, peaceful as before. Elena sank into the chair, her hands shaking. She stayed there until morning, watching him, afraid to leave in case it happened again. When the doctors came later, they said it was a good sign, that patients in comas sometimes respond to familiar voices as they start to recover. But none of them understood what it meant to her. He had said her name. For the first time since the wedding, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for herself, but for him. For the man who had unknowingly become the center of her quiet, complicated world. And deep inside, she made a silent promise that no matter what happened, she would stay until he woke up. The morning after Alexander whispered her name, everything felt different for Elena. The air in his room didn't feel as heavy anymore. For the first time since the wedding, she woke up with a sense of hope instead of dread. She walked to his room quietly, as she always did, carrying a small vase of white lilies. The nurses greeted her politely, already used to her daily routine. But today when she entered, she paused at the door. The light from the window fell across his face, and he looked slightly more alive, as if color had returned to his skin. She placed the flowers on the table beside his bed and sat down in her usual chair. For a while, she just looked at him. He seemed peaceful, but not as distant as before. She reached out and touched his hand gently. "Good morning," she said softly. "It's me again." There was no response, but she thought she saw a faint movement in his fingers. Her heart began to race, but she tried to stay calm. She didn't want to imagine things again. Still, every little sign gave her strength to stay. The doctors continued their work as usual. They noted small improvements, but no one dared to call it recovery yet. One of them told Elena, "He's responding to sound better now. It's a good sign. Keep talking to him." It might help, so she did. Every day she talked more. She told him about the house, about the garden, about the people who worked there. She told him stories from her nursing days and about how much she missed her old apartment in the city. Sometimes she even read old magazines out loud just to fill the silence. As weeks passed, she began to notice something else. The people in the mansion had started watching her. The staff no longer looked at her with just curiosity. Now there were whispers. She could hear her name in quiet conversations when she walked by. One afternoon, as she entered the kitchen to get some tea, the voices stopped suddenly. Two maids stood near the sink, looking guilty. Elena smiled politely, pretending not to notice. "Good afternoon," she said softly. They nodded quickly and turned back to their work. But as she walked away, she caught a few words they hadn't meant for her to hear. "She talks to him like he's her husband for real," one whispered. "Maybe she's starting to believe it," the other replied. Elena stopped in the hallway, her hands tightening around the cup. She felt a sharp sting in her chest. It wasn't anger, not really. It was shame. She had known people would talk, but hearing it still hurt. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the rain fall over the dark garden. The whispering shouldn't have bothered her, but it did. Maybe because part of it was true. Maybe deep down she was starting to care too much. Days later, Mrs. Grant called her to the study. The older woman's face was calm, but her tone was sharp. "I've been hearing that you spend most of your time in Alexander's room," she said. "You don't have to explain, I understand. But you must be careful. People will talk. This family's reputation is fragile." Elena lowered her head. "I just want to help him recover." Mrs. Grant nodded, though her eyes were unreadable. "And you are helping. But remember, you're here for a reason. Once he wakes up, everything will return to the way it should be." The words lingered in Elena's mind long after the conversation ended. Return to the way it should be. What did that mean? Would they tell him the truth? Would he know about the marriage? Or would they erase her from his life the moment he opened his eyes? Still, she continued her visits. She couldn't stay away, no matter how much she told herself to keep her distance. There was something about sitting beside him that brought her peace, even if it made no sense. One evening she came in and noticed that the nurse had changed the flowers on his table. The lilies she brought every day had been replaced with red roses. They were beautiful but unfamiliar. She asked quietly, "Who brought these?" "Mrs. Grant," the nurse replied. "She said he used to like roses better." Elena nodded. She didn't say anything, but when she sat down, she couldn't stop staring at them. The roses were lovely, but they didn't feel right. They were too perfect, too polished, and like something from a photograph. The lilies, simple and quiet, had felt more like him somehow. That night she had a dream that felt too real. She dreamed that Alexander opened his eyes and looked straight at her. He smiled faintly and said, "I knew you'd come back." She woke up with tears on her cheeks, her heart beating fast. The next morning she went to his room earlier than usual. As she entered, she froze. Mrs. Grant was already there, sitting beside the bed. She was talking softly to her son, holding his hand. For a moment, Elena stood quietly by the door, not wanting to interrupt. Mrs. Grant looked up, her expression neutral. "You're early today," she said. "I couldn't sleep," Elena replied. Mrs. Grant gave a small nod and stood up. "He seems more responsive lately. The doctors are optimistic." "Yes," Elena said softly. "He moved his hand yesterday." "I think he can hear us." Mrs. Grant studied her for a moment. "You care for him deeply, don't you?" Elena hesitated. "I just want him to be well." Mrs. Grant gave a faint smile, though there was something unreadable in her eyes. "That's good. He'll need kindness when he wakes up." Then she left the room, her perfume lingering in the air. Elena sat down in the chair, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. She didn't know what Mrs. Grant meant, but something about her tone made Elena uneasy. Over the next few days, she began to notice more changes. The nurses seemed to be more alert around Alexander, checking his vitals more often. The doctors spoke in shorter sentences as if they didn't want to raise expectations, but couldn't hide their surprise. One afternoon, as Elena was reading a book aloud, she felt a faint pressure on her hand. She froze, staring at his fingers. They had curled slightly around hers. "Alexander?" she whispered. His eyes stayed closed, but she felt it again, the smallest squeeze. Her breath caught. Tears welled up as she whispered, "You can hear me, can't you?" A nurse walked in just then, and Elena called her quickly. The nurse checked his pulse, her expression calm but focused. "He's responding to touch," she said. "This is a very good sign." Elena could barely speak. She stayed with him until late that night, holding his hand, whispering softly. For the first time, she felt like maybe he wasn't so far away after all. But not everyone in the house shared her hope. Some of the staff seemed nervous, whispering about what would happen when he finally woke up. "He won't even know he's married," one of them said one morning when she passed by the laundry room. Imagine waking up to that. Elena didn't stop walking, but their words followed her. It was true. He didn't know. When he opened his eyes, he would have no idea that she was his wife, at least on paper. That night, she stood beside his bed and said quietly, "When you wake up, I'll tell you everything. Even if it costs me everything, I'll tell you the truth." The next day, the doctor smiled as he checked the machines. "His reflexes are improving," he said. "We're getting close." Elena felt her heart fill with both hope and fear. Close. What would happen when close became awake? That evening, she sat beside him, reading softly. The sun was setting, painting the room in golden light. Suddenly, she heard a soft groan. Her book fell from her hands. She looked up quickly. His fingers moved again, this time more clearly. Then his eyelids fluttered, her heart pounded. "Alexander?" she whispered. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. He blinked several times, trying to adjust to the light. When his gaze finally met hers, she froze. He was awake. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His lips parted slightly and his voice came out weak and rough. "Where am I?" Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks. "You're in the hospital wing. You were in an accident. You're safe now." He frowned, trying to understand. His eyes moved around the room, then returned to her face. "Who are you?" The words hit her like a knife. She opened her mouth to answer, but her throat closed up. Before she could speak, Mrs. Grant rushed into the room, followed by doctors and nurses. She went straight to her son's side, tears in her eyes. "Oh, thank God. You're awake." The room filled with noise. Doctors checking monitors, nurses giving instructions. Elena stepped back, her hands trembling. No one noticed her standing there in the corner. As they surrounded him, she quietly left the room, her heart heavy. She should have been happy. He was alive. But all she could think about was the way he had looked at her, with confusion, not recognition. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about his voice. "Who are you?" It echoed in her mind again and again. Over the next few days, Alexander's recovery continued. He was weak but conscious. The doctor said his memory might take time to return. Mrs. Grant stayed by his side constantly, rarely leaving the room. Elena visited when she could, but her presence now felt awkward. The staff who once called her Mrs. Grant now simply nodded politely. She felt invisible again. One afternoon, she entered quietly, holding a small bouquet of lilies. Alexander was awake, sitting slightly upright. Mrs. Grant was feeding him soup. He looked pale but alert. When he saw Elena, his eyes followed her for a moment, curious but uncertain. Mrs. Grant glanced at her. "You can leave those on the table," she said kindly but firmly. Elena nodded and placed the flowers down. She hesitated, then whispered, "It's good to see you awake." He gave a faint smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice still soft. "I've been told you helped during my recovery." Elena's heart ached at his politeness. "I'm just glad you're better," she said quietly. He nodded again, then looked away. Mrs. Grant smiled at her, a smile that said, "Thank you, now go." Elena walked out of the room slowly, holding back tears. The distance between them now felt wider than ever. That night, she sat in her room, staring at the ring on her finger. To everyone else, it was a symbol of security and success. To her, it was a reminder of everything she had lost. Her honesty, her peace, her sense of who she was. The next morning, she decided she couldn't keep living in the shadows of lies. When he was strong enough, she would tell him everything, about the marriage, about Vivian, about how it all began. He deserved to know the truth, but deep inside she also feared what that truth would do. Because now that he was awake, the story she had been living quietly in the background was about to collide with reality. And once that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Alexander woke up were filled with a strange silence in the mansion. Everyone moved carefully, speaking in hushed voices as if any sound might disturb the fragile balance that had returned with his consciousness. Elena noticed it the most. The house that had once felt like a heavy cage now felt hollow, almost foreign. Every morning she would walk past his room, her steps slowing down without meaning to. She wanted to go in and see him, to ask how he was feeling, but each time she stopped herself. She wasn't sure if she still had the right. When she did see him, it was usually from a distance. He was always surrounded by doctors, by Mrs. Grant, sometimes even by a few business associates who had started to visit again. The world around him was waking up just as he had, and Elena found herself slipping into the background. But even from afar, she noticed something strange. His eyes followed her sometimes. When she passed by, he would pause as if trying to remember where he'd seen her before. It was subtle, but she saw it. The small frown, the searching look. A few days later, one of the nurses came to her quietly. "He keeps asking about you," she whispered. "He says he remembers your voice." Elena's heart skipped. "My voice?" The nurse nodded. He said it was familiar, like something he heard when he wasn't fully awake. That night, Elena lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. He remembered her voice. He didn't remember her face or name, but the sound of her voice had stayed with him. That thought made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain. The next morning, she gathered the courage to visit. When she walked into the room, Alexander was sitting up in bed reading a newspaper. He looked thinner than before, weaker, but his eyes were sharp, and they went straight to her the moment she entered. For a second, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "You're her." Elena blinked. "Her?" "The voice," he said slowly. "I remember you talking. I don't know what you said, but it felt calm." Her hands trembled slightly. "I used to sit with you when you were asleep," she said softly, "just to keep you company." He studied her face for a moment, his gaze gentle but curious. "Why would you do that?" She hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Because you didn't have anyone to talk to, and I thought maybe you could hear me." A faint smile touched his lips. "Maybe I did." The nurse stepped in to check his IV, breaking the moment. Elena excused herself quietly, but as she left, she could still feel his eyes on her. Later that evening, Mrs. Grant called her into the study again. The room smelled of cedar and old paper. Mrs. Grant sat behind her desk, hands folded neatly. "I heard you visited Alexander today," she said. "Yes," Elena replied softly. Mrs. Grant nodded. "He mentioned it. He said your voice seemed familiar." Elena stayed quiet. The older woman looked at her with a mix of caution and fatigue. "He's confused right now. The doctors say his memory may take weeks, maybe months to come back. Until then, it's best not to burden him with unnecessary information." Elena frowned slightly. "Do you mean about the marriage?" Mrs. Grant's eyes met hers. "Yes, there's no need to confuse him with that right now. When he's stronger, we can decide what to tell him." Elena wanted to argue, but she didn't. She just nodded quietly and left the room. That night, she walked alone through the garden. The moonlight made the roses glow faintly, and for a moment everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. But inside her, a storm was building. She wanted to believe Mrs. Grant's words were meant to protect him, but deep down she felt something wasn't right. Days passed and Alexander grew stronger. He started walking short distances with help, talking more, asking questions. He wanted to know what had happened, who had been taking care of things, and most of all, what had become of Vivian. When he asked about her, the air in the room always shifted. Mrs. Grant would change the subject or the doctor would step in. No one told him the truth, that Vivian had disappeared after the accident, running from guilt and pain, leaving her sister behind to live the life meant for her. Elena carried that truth like a weight on her chest. Every time he asked, she wanted to tell him. But each time she tried, Mrs. Grant's voice echoed in her head. It's best not to burden him yet. One afternoon, he asked her directly. It was the first time they were alone in the room together. He was sitting near the window, a blanket draped over his legs, looking at the garden. Elena, he said, using her name properly for the first time. I know you've been avoiding me. She looked startled. No, I just didn't want to disturb you. He smiled faintly. You used to talk to me every day when I was asleep. Now that I'm awake, you barely speak at all. She didn't know what to say. He turned his head slightly, watching her. Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Of course, she said quietly. He hesitated. Were we close? Before the accident, I mean. The question made her freeze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Why would you ask that? She managed. He shrugged gently. Because when I see you, I feel something. Familiar, I guess. Like I should know you. She forced a small smile. Maybe it's because I spent so much time here. The mind remembers sounds, places, even feelings. He nodded slowly, but his eyes told her he didn't quite believe that. When she left the room, she leaned against the hallway wall, her hands shaking. She knew she couldn't keep lying forever. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at a letter she'd been writing for days. It was meant for Alexander. Everything she wanted to tell him but couldn't say out loud. About the forced marriage, the family's decision, her sister's disappearance. She wanted him to know the truth, even if it meant losing everything. But before she could finish it, there was a knock on her door. It was Mrs. Grant. "Elena," she said softly, stepping inside. "You need to pack your things." Elena's heart stopped. "What?" "He's strong enough now. He doesn't need you anymore. The doctors agree. You can return to your life." Elena shook her head, but Mrs. Grant raised her hand. "Please, you've done enough. I'll make sure you're compensated well. But it's time for you to go." Elena stood there, speechless. She wanted to ask what about him. What about the truth? But the look in Mrs. Grant's eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger, it was fear. That night, Elena packed quietly. The house felt different now, colder somehow. She looked around her small room, the place that had held her worries, her tears, her small hopes. Then she folded the letter and placed it on his nightstand while he slept. She whispered, "I hope one day you'll understand." And then she left. When Alexander woke up the next morning, she was gone. At first he didn't notice. The days passed in a blur of doctor visits and therapy sessions. He walked through the halls trying to remember pieces of his past. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice. That soft, steady tone that had comforted him when everything else was dark. One evening, he asked his mother, "Where's Elena?" Mrs. Grant hesitated. "She's gone. She was a nurse hired to help during your recovery." He frowned. "Just a nurse?" "Yes," she said quickly. "She's gone back to her life." He looked away, but something in him didn't believe that. He could still see her face, hear the way she said his name. It didn't feel like a nurse-patient bond. It felt deeper, something unspoken, unfinished. As days turned into weeks, his strength returned, but his heart felt restless. He started walking through the garden every afternoon, often stopping near the bench where he thought he remembered hearing her laugh. One afternoon, while he was sitting there, the housekeeper came out to bring him tea. She was new and didn't know the rules about what not to say. As she set the tray down, she said casually, "The young lady who used to bring flowers there every morning loved this spot." She said it reminded her of peace. Alexander looked up. "Young lady?" "Elena," she said before realizing her mistake. "I mean Miss Elena." He stared at her. "Tell me the truth. Who was she?" The housekeeper hesitated, then whispered, "She was your wife, but they didn't want you to know yet." The cup of tea trembled in his hand. "My wife?" She nodded quickly. "I shouldn't have said anything. Please don't tell Mrs. Grant I told you." He didn't hear the rest. His mind went blank. His wife. The woman whose voice had followed him out of the darkness, the one who had cared for him when he couldn't even breathe on his own, was his wife. That night, he couldn't sleep. Everything made sense now. Her silence, her sadness, the way she had looked at him as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. The next morning, he confronted his mother. She tried to explain, to defend the decision as something done for the family, for the company, for appearances. But he didn't hear much of it. All he could think about was that she was gone, and that she had been forced into all of this. "Where is she?" he asked finally. Mrs. Grant sighed. "I don't know. She left. And maybe that's for the best. But it wasn't for the best, not for him. Within days, he made arrangements to find her. The doctors advised rest, but he ignored them. He needed answers. He needed to look into her eyes and hear her truth. Meanwhile, Elena had returned to her small apartment in the city. It felt both familiar and strange after everything she had been through. She tried to start fresh, got a part-time job at a local clinic, spent her evenings quietly reading by the window. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, she was leaving work when she saw a black car parked by the gate. A man stepped out, one of the drivers from the mansion. "Miss Elena," he said respectfully, "Mr. Alexander wishes to see you." Her heart froze. "He knows?" The driver nodded. "He found out everything. She hesitated for a long moment, her mind racing. She had dreamed of this moment for weeks, but now that it was real, she felt terrified. What would he say? Would he hate her for lying? Finally, she took a deep breath. "Take me to him." As the car drove through the familiar roads back to the mansion, her hands shook slightly. When she arrived, he was waiting in the garden, standing near the old bench where she used to sit. He looked stronger now, but his eyes were softer, and when they met hers, there was no anger. Only quiet pain. She stopped a few feet away. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "I had to." Neither spoke for a moment. The air between them felt heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, he said quietly, "You should have told me." Tears filled her eyes. "I wanted to, every day, but they said it would hurt you." He stepped closer. "The only thing that hurts is knowing you went through all of that alone." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I never wanted any of this. I was supposed to help for a few weeks. Then everything changed." "I know," he said gently, "and I know you didn't do it for money or fame. You did it because you have a heart that cares too much." She finally looked up at him, her eyes full of emotion. "So what happens now?" He smiled faintly. "Now we start again, honestly this time." And for the first time since the accident, both of them felt like maybe, just maybe, they could breathe again. But deep down, neither of them knew that the hardest part was still ahead, because the truth, once revealed, never stays quiet for long. The night air was cool and soft, filled with the faint scent of roses from the garden. Elena and Alexander stood facing each other, the silence between them heavy but peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after too many words had been held back for too long. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fountain nearby made a gentle sound as the water fell into the basin, steady and calming. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "I don't remember everything," he said quietly, "but I remember how I felt when I heard your voice. It made me want to live again." Elena's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. The truth was, she had never imagined this moment, standing before him, not as a caretaker, not as a name on a marriage paper, but as herself. She lowered her eyes. "When you were in the hospital bed, I used to talk to you for hours," she said softly. "Sometimes I thought I was going crazy, but I couldn't stop. It was the only way I felt close to you." He smiled faintly. "Then I'm glad you didn't stop." For a moment, they both just stood there watching the wind move through the trees. Then he said, "Come inside. You must be tired." Inside, the house looked the same as before, but it didn't feel the same. The walls that once seemed cold now felt alive, touched by the quiet tension between them. Mrs. Grant was waiting in the living room. When she saw Elena, her expression froze. "Elena," she said, standing up, "you shouldn't have come." "I asked her to," Alexander said calmly. Mrs. Grant looked at him, startled. "You shouldn't be stressing yourself with all this right now. You need rest." "I'm fine," he replied. His tone was polite but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "I just want the truth." Mrs. Grant sighed deeply. "The truth won't change what's been done." "Maybe not," he said, "but it will decide what happens next." The older woman hesitated, then sat back down slowly. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Alexander turned to Elena. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Her heart pounded as she began to speak. She told him about the night of the accident, about his engagement to her sister, about the shock of the proposal that never happened. She told him how the family had pressured her, how the doctors had said he might not survive, and how his mother feared that the company would fall apart if the engagement wasn't secured. At first, her voice trembled, but the more she spoke, the stronger she became. She didn't try to make herself look innocent. She simply told the truth, every detail, every feeling. When she finished, the room was silent. Alexander's face was calm, but his eyes were full of thought. He looked at his mother slowly. "Is this true?" Mrs. Grant hesitated, then nodded. "It was a terrible time," she said quietly. "We were desperate. The media, the shareholders, everyone was watching. I didn't want to lose everything your father built, and she was the only one who agreed to help." Elena looked down, her hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no." For a long time, Alexander didn't speak. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room. Then finally, he said softly, "You both saved me, in very different ways." Mrs. Grant looked at him, confused. Saved you? He nodded. You kept the company alive, and she gave me something I didn't even realize I'd lost. Faith. Mrs. Grant's eyes softened. Faith in what? He looked at Elena. In people. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected forgiveness, and not like this. Mrs. Grant stood slowly, her voice trembling slightly. I did what I thought was right at the time, but maybe it wasn't fair to either of you. Alexander nodded quietly. No, it wasn't, but it's over now.